You ever create the title of a talk and then forget that you actually have to write what you said you were going to talk about? That's where we're at. So I don't know the answer to this question, but we'll give it a shot. I forgot kind of that I'm not a prophet. I'm just a historian. And when I began to kind of under the gun assemble a kind of what I hope is a coherent answer to this outlandish question, I started with a pretty pessimistic view, I think, of where attitudes and technologies are leading us, but then my training took over. And by that I mean, I'm a historian, I want to think long-term about these issues. And secondly, it kind of occurred to me recently that in my context, in the Myaamia community, among Myaamia intellectuals, of which I'm not one, but I'm around them all the time, it's very strengths-based, it's quite optimistic, it's not deficits-based. It doesn't dwell on some of what we as academics like to dwell on, which can be sometimes focused on problems, and that's also really useful, but those are kind of the inclinations that came over me. So today, I want to think about language and translating, and this guy, David Saxon, Professor Saxon, helps us think about that. Some of us in academia need to learn how other people speak, and I think that's literal in terms of like indigenous languages, but also metaphorical. Academics have a certain way of speaking that's not how other humans speak, and I think that's true in Indian country as well, and that's fine. So let's use that kind of the metaphor as our through line. I'll be a bit metaphorical today, translating in order to move between the past and the future, between academia and Indian country. And I'll start with history. After all, that's what I do. But I'll try to live up to the promise of telling you something about where this seems to be going. So in some ways, I'm translating actually the implications, the larger implications in this book that Bobbe and I wrote called Our People Believe in Education. And lately, I've been thinking with many others about technology and language. And so in the Myaami language, Myaamia Talwenge, a computer is called Kinde Linda Akane, and that's a tool for thinking quickly. And we all know that's not always the best strategy. Thinking quickly can get us into trouble. A book is a different technology. It's a tool for thinking deliberately. And it's a useful technology to sustain an argument and think through something a bit slower. And so I hope that that's useful. That said, I wrote this a long time ago, and I couldn't really remember what we put in it, so I asked AI to do the thinking for me. I thought quickly, or AI did it, the robot did it for me. And so this book, it does explain how and why an alliance developed between a Native American nation and an American public university. And it puts that history in the context of Native and educational studies. In other words, there's a literature to this. The purpose of the alliance today, just to be clear, is education and cultural reclamation as directed by and for Myaamiaki. In other words, education in the present is a response to education in the past. That's the basic argument. And the book maps kind of how we got here, almost to this room. And then, I'm a human, I couldn't help myself, so I thought, well, robot, is it good? Like, did it work? And it started kind of lying to my face. I mean, there's only promotional material out there, and so it was just pulling like all this like glowing stuff. And it's definitely not heartwarming. I mean, I don't know. And I looked, and that actually came from Kelly, who made a Facebook comment, and you didn't call the book heartwarming, which is fine, I can take that. But it was heartwarming to you, Kelly, that your tribe had worked so hard to make the relationship work and beneficial. And so that's what was, so anyways, I understand why people can become like best friends with robots now, because this is pumping me up quite a bit. Us, if I say I. So my thinking comes from a lot of places, but I think the messiness of this corridor is a fitting metaphor. Bobbe Burke basically collected all the stuff that went into this relationship for the last century. And from this, the backbone of the narrative was formed out of the primary sources. You can see graduating students on the wall on the left. You can see preparations for this conference on the right. You can see that Gretchen is apparently never in her office. I don't know where she is. I'm just kidding. We try to bring some coherence to this image. We can think of, I think, 4 big conversations worth having about this relationship between higher education and Indian country, at least in the context of the Miami-Myaami relationship. Today I want to focus on 2, which is kind of the land-based fiduciary relationship between schools and native nations. That is the acquisition of capital among first world universities like this one, and how that impacts educational work today, like language revitalization. And then from that, skipping a few conversations, how or why an alliance could be forged actually despite that history. Let's begin with the land. We're on Treaty of Greenville territory right now, in jurisdiction that was relinquished by a dozen nations to the new settler sovereign. I'm talking Miamis, but also Shawnees, Wyandots, some Anishinaabe groups, Potawatomis that are in the room. And that was in 1795. And 1809 is when MU was founded. So this treaty created new relations. The U.S. developed the treaty as a technology to separate Native folks from their territories, and in turn to sell their territories to U.S. citizen settlers. And the land, I want to emphasize this, the land was going to pay for all kinds of public services for Americans. Things like public schools and universities too. In this bargain, the U.S. promised to pay yearly payments to Native nations, and those are called annuities. They're paid yearly. Of course, colonization then continued and continues. Beginning in 1796 and continuing, the U.S. has used a portfolio of financial instruments as tools of colonization. So almost from the start, the U.S. has served as a trustee of native wealth. And I don't just mean that in the sense of the trustee of trust land, of reservation lands, but literally trust funds that the U.S. then could invest in various projects. So this system, whereby native land is expropriated for the use of the colonizing nation, and then the return is a trust fund that can be used to finance the same colonizing nation. So in a metaphor, land is the motor of American development. And for example, and many of you are probably aware of this map from Margaret Pierce, work on Land Grab U. This includes land sales to generate principal and land rents to generate revenues for universities. And the book goes into maybe excruciating detail about how that system worked here at Miami University before the Morrill Land Grant. So Miami is not represented on this map, but fits into the picture. So this land's generated revenue for universities. In other words, Native nations are and have been investors in the United States at the federal and state levels, including all aspects of education since the beginning of the country. Let's get into an example that's not in the book. For example, in 1854, the Miamis consent to privatize their reservation in Kansas into individual allotments, relinquishing something like 80% of the nation's land to U.S. dominion. In return, the Miami Nation received a small suite of promises, including that $50,000 would be invested on their behalf by their trustee, great father, president, to accrue interest to be used for educational purposes. This is a common, but I think understudied aspect of our shared history, everyone in this room. Why would the Miami sign this? This colonialism by contract was a system chosen by the colonizers, that's the United States. And I take a lot of direction from the thinker Scott Richard Lyons, who tells us that these agreements are, he says, contaminated, coerced signs of consent in conditions that are not of one's making. Very useful here. It's power and lack of power. An X mark is a decision one makes when something has already been decided for you, but it's still a decision. And I want us to pay attention because there's always the possibility in X marks that there could be unintended results down the line. It's always possible that an X mark could result in something good. Why else, we must ask, would someone bother to make it? So, the Miamis assented to this 1854 deal with very little wiggle room in the negotiation, signing their X marks there at the Miami Village on the Kansas reservation. This is before another removal to Oklahoma, Indian Territory. To get into the weeds a bit, The Miamis, of course, this is a coerced contract, little power, but the lead negotiator, the elected chief, Myaamia, he's called Big Leg or Big Legs here, he did push back. Like, this is consistent. Miami people are pushing back on coercion. Here we see him demanding money. This is treaty-guaranteed money from previous treaties in Indiana to fund a local school on the reserve, sorry. Consistent, like all the time, asking, like, where's the money that came from the land that should fund our local school? In the context of this fiduciary relationship between the U.S. on the one hand and the Miami Nation on the other, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs wanted to end the Miami annuity after a period of years. Myaamia here says their party don't want it that way. They want the annuity forever. And in a very telling turn of events, this is kind of consistent, I'm using it as an example of a larger theme, Commissioner Moneypenny responded saying to his face that your annuity dies with the extinction of your tribe. Of course, if the tribe no longer existed, then the U.S. would no longer be a colonizer. The relationship would have ended. And the U.S., that would solve really one of the largest problems that the U.S. has had since 1776, which is the continued existence of native nations. Without going too far into the details, notice that the commissioner kind of dissembles and returns, let's get back to the land. Let's talk about the land. How about the land? So land, like the motor for American state and institutions like schools, I want to point out that these trust funds were part of the federal government's sources of investment. So I picked out some samples. Here we see the Confederated Peorias and the Menominees as investors or bondholders and lenders to states and the federal debt, so state and federal governments. The Miami Trust Fund sat relatively untouched. So the Miamis had money just sitting in the Treasury, but it drew interest in the U.S. Treasury for some undetermined number of years. I'm not sure what happened to this trust fund. It's a huge slush fund, the land. To recap so far, there's this long-standing and still existing both general and specific relationship between dispossession and our American educational landscape. Occurred to me this morning that it's kind of cliche to use Nelson Mandela in a presentation, but he used a different metaphor at the APS some time ago. Education is a weapon. And weapons, it seems to me, can be used for a whole range of purposes. So let's turn to educational technologies. There's this settler colonial habit, let's call it, in places like the US or Canada or Australia or New Zealand of trying to engineer the disappearance of native people as native people. Here, here and on the slide in 1814, James McBride is kind of the primary booster of early Miami University. He saw a future where native folks disappeared and this university took your place. In other words, the Miami University would replace the Miami people, according to his view, and this would be a cause of celebration. I think his imagination in 1814 could not have imagined this. That was not part of his future. To take a quote and turn it into a picture, many of you have seen this. John Gass' American Progress tells 1,000 words. It tells us about this type of colonialism. And when I use this in class, I ask my students, what do you see here? And we kind of can digest it as a primary source. For our conversation today, what is Columbia, the symbol of America, holding? SKU book. And we sit within, I won't make too much of this, but we sit within sight of where the most famous American school books were actually concocted by this guy named William Holmes McGuffey, who's a Miami professor in the 1820s and 30s. In other words, I would suspect that this is a McGuffey school book, because that is the school book, if you think of a school book for John Gass. These became standard curriculum in BIA-funded schools, and I could never find a Miami person talking explicitly about McGuffey, so I went to the next best thing, which is a Peoria person in the Peoria school right there talking about learning from McGuffey readers. Let's turn to other books. The book that Bobby and I put together sits kind of between the history of education on the one hand and theories of educational and indigenous futures on the other. So what we're talking about today, I want to make this point before going on to the next slide. What I think this relationship is not decolonizing the university. I think that's not what's happening. Instead, and decolonizing is a buzzword. Let's say Miamifying the university. Instead, it's using the university to Miamify Miami people. The way that LePaperson put it is that Myaamiaki are using a university to aid in indigenizing work. They aren't Miamifying Miami, they're using Myaamia to aid in Myaamia reclamation. And LePaperson calls people, if you ever look at a book and it's by a lowercase LePaperson and there's nothing on the cover, you're in for a slow read. You got to figure out what he's talking about, she is talking about in this case. LePaperson calls, so go with me, LePaperson calls people who do this kind of work cyborgs. Someone who takes the colonial apparatus and re-engineers them for decolonization, or kind of like a mechanic retooling the academy for indigenous futures. Now, LePaperson bases this these useful thoughts on queer, Black, third world liberation, femtech theorists. Cyborgs disassemble the university machine from the inside and reassemble it for indigenous, or let's say Miamification purposes. There are clear strains of this kind of thinking in Myaamia philosophy, even though I don't think that Chief Leonard would have, correct me if I'm wrong, but wouldn't have been like femtech cyborg theorists probably, but there is some of that. It makes sense to me. It's not, so this kind of pragmatic philosophy, let's say, does use a set of metaphors, and they're just not cyborg. They're nahe metasenewingi, tending that fire, weaving things together, picking up the threads, anj takyake, people that are change makers, planting seeds, and gardeners, and so forth. That's what these cyborgs are, perhaps. Mildred Walker here talking about her experience in Seneca Indian School in Oklahoma, circumventing the system. So conversations about these relationships often use metaphors. Cyborgs, X marks, less metaphorical, more explicit, adaptive resistance, which I think is very useful, from Ben Secunda talking about Potawatomi change over time. A really useful legal concept from Hopi legal thought from Richland and Sekakwapeta. Sekakwapeta. I practiced that, actually. Cooperation without submission, which I see happening in Ottawa County as well. But with clear, if I'm being kind of optimistic, I want to also call out that there are clear cautions. For example, Kasia Henneque calls attention to grafting, another metaphor, which is that institutions will only accept perspectives as long as they don't challenge the status quo. A university will graft Myaamia stuff, accepting it as part of the school, but reject Myaamia education that isn't consistent with, let's say, capitalist ways of knowing or settler ways of knowing. To put this in different terms, maybe the key to harnessing the power of the university is not letting the university harness you instead. Coming towards the close, let's look at what this actually looks like here and now. This Venn diagram of these giant institutions that's a Native American tribe and an American public university. Let's zoom into the zone of the cyborgs. The key shared realms are, on the ground, are tuition waivers for Myaamiaki, the joint sustenance capital of the Myaamia Center and its human and financial resources, and the agreement that protects Myaamia cultural property and patrimony. think of, and we use this in the book as well, think of an old metaphor that Myaamia and their relatives used to use of two paths, or a path, a good path, where allies promise to remove obstacles from each other's path. Kind of, I'll remove the stumps and the branches in your way so that you can go on a good road and we can see each other clearly. To remove obstacles from each other's path in a good way. So the MHL is the common icon that represents, it's a metaphor of these very real commitments. Another tool or machine, a real effect of this is something like ILDA, which is created kind of in a community context using university resources, but engineered for indigenous futures. The Indigenous Languages Database Archive, ILDA. So, cultural revitalization doesn't grow out of a university. Education maybe doesn't stem from a school always, but schools can be made to support tribal initiatives with a bit of tinkering, or maybe a lot of tinkering, and maybe some capital investment as well. And if we do the accounting, I think we'll see that Native nations have already paid into the system for 2 centuries. So the Miami communities have harnessed the power of this university to help pull this thing called cultural revitalization as done and directed by Myaamiaki. It's still very much a question of, if this is a healthy relationship, what makes it more healthy? What does a healthy relationship look in 50 years, or 100 years, or 200 years, maybe when the university no longer exists? I think of this thing, this Myaamia Center, this thing that we're doing, as kind of a Myaamia tribal college. It's a think tank, it's an incubator. It's also kind of a seed bank. It's a form of soft power that's been launched into the heritage homelands that then kind of spreads Myaamia ideas, or at least Myaamia awareness, into the communities around here. I get a lot out of this photo. Thank goodness Karen took this, and thank goodness Brandon was wearing this shirt. This is at MTO at Miami Tribe headquarters, as far as I can tell, with the lacrosse stick there. Strong, resilient Myaamia, but also I notice, and I want to point this out, the boy wearing a Miami University shirt. That Miami University is just part of the wallpaper in Myaamia. So schools are equipped to aid revitalization. If non-transmission was, and community ill health, which is a larger maybe byproduct, resulted from generations of investment in policy and labor, then the recovery will require investment, policy, and labor long term. Or, as Toni Morrison said, another cliche, we speak, we write, we do language. Kind of a nonsensical but awesome way of putting it.